and thanks to everybody who's joined so far. God, all over the world is fantastic. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who'll be watching this maybe later recording. So today, we're going to talk a lot about the climate solutions we need to explore in the broader topic around food and agriculture and land use. And so I'm going to give a presentation for a while, kind of presenting some science and framework for maybe thinking about that. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to have some time for discussion and Q&A. So should be a lot of fun. So let me share some slides and let's just go ahead and get started then. Okay. So we're going to be talking about the links between the food that we eat, the way farmers grow that food around the world, the land that we have to use to do that, and how all of this connects to climate change in our atmosphere and the future of our planet. So it's going to be some pretty heady stuff connecting to the atmosphere, to our carbon cycle, climate change, all these kinds of big global abstract things. But at the end of the day, we do have to remember that food is very personal to all of us. We engage with it often, 2, 3, 4 times a day. And so food is very personal. It gets us emotionally charged and really, really sentimental about different things. And we're going to have to work through some of that. And food touches everybody in the world in one way or another, either someone who eats, but also all the people in the world who produce food. And I think it's important to remember the people who really are the heroes of our food system, who work so hard to nourish and sustain not only the lands that they work on, but also all of us in our civilization. So today we're going to celebrate agriculture and food, but also look very hard at how we need to rethink the food system to make it a truly nourishing and sustainable future for the world. So food is not only touching us, it touches the whole world and transforms it. One of the incredible things about food is how much of the planet is devoted to the simple act of growing what we eat. And the history of agriculture has been one that has been associated with clearing enormous sums of land. Right now, agriculture uses about 35 to 40% of all the land on Earth. It's an extraordinary amount, and it's grown hugely in the last couple of centuries. And we know this. We can look at farms from an airplane as we fly over, or maybe from satellites, and see landscapes that are clearly devoted to agriculture and food all over the world, whether it's like the Midwestern US or Europe or Bolivia or rice paddies in Thailand or big soy farms in Brazil. Agriculture is touching landscapes everywhere in very different ways, but all with the same goal of growing plants to use for food or feed or biofuels, fiber, and other things. But if we step back even further and look at the whole Earth, one of the extraordinary things is how much of the Earth's land is used for food. For example, all of that green area you see on this map today, these are the world's croplands, areas that are growing the major crops of the world, like wheat and rice and corn and soybeans and carrots and blueberries and everything. Added together, if that was all in one place, that'd be the equivalent of about 16 million square kilometers of land. That's roughly the size of South America. We have a South America's worth of land on Earth today just doing one thing, growing crops. An even larger area in the kind of tan and orange colors is used for grazing land. This is land that is just devoted to grazing animals. And that's 34 million square kilometers, or about the size of an Africa's worth of land. And put together, the croplands of the world and our pastures and rangelands are a total of 37% of all the land on Earth. This is extraordinary because just compare it to cities. Our cities and suburbs, all the land we complain about living in and driving through and whatever, that's less than 1% of Earth's land is basically all the people. But farms take up over 60 times more land than all the world's cities and suburbs combined. So to first order, the world's largest ecosystem is food, and nothing else that humans do comes close to that in terms of overall real estate. So 37% of the Earth's land is used for growing food. One of the remarkable things is how much of that 37%, how much of that area is devoted to one subcategory of food, animal agriculture. It turns out of all that land, the Africa and South America's worth of real estate devoted to food, 75% of that is used for animals. either for grazing them out in pastures and rangelands, or to grow crops that are in turn used as animal feed. For example, most of the corn and soybeans in North America are used for animal feed, so that land counts there too. So the biggest thing we do on the planet is food, and the biggest thing of that is raise animals or the food that they eat. So what does this mean? Well, we use a lot of land, but does it have consequences? Yeah, absolutely it does, because that land used to be doing something else. Clearing land for agriculture means that whatever was there before, whether it's a natural habitat like a rainforest or a savanna or something else, means that that land was replaced and cleared, and that habitat and the biological diversity, the species that once lived there, have now been wiped out or replaced with something else. And this is really important. For example, agriculture has already wiped out ecosystems like the North American prairie, the coastal Atlantic forest of Brazil, and many other ecosystems. But now it's responsible for clearing very critical ecosystems like tropical rainforest. And right now, rainforest, about a third of the world's tropical rainforest have been cleared primarily for agriculture. Whether it's beef or animal feed or palm oil, tropical forests are still under assault by being cleared for agricultural production. So agriculture has made a huge dent in the biodiversity and habitats available in the world's forest, our grasslands, savannas, and cerrados around the world, our freshwater ecosystems, and even coastal environments have all been heavily impacted by the land footprint of agriculture. So agriculture uses more land than anything else by far that humans have ever done. It is also the biggest user of water. So when we think about water, it turns out that humans have started to use an enormous amount of water by building dams and then diverting water for human use over the last century or so. And most of that water, over 70% of it, is used for just one thing: irrigating farmland. So we can see irrigation from space. We see how we suck water out of huge natural water flows like the Colorado River, the Agawa Aquifer, or Lake Chad in Africa. All of these are collapsing because we've taken water out of nature, spray it in the air to irrigate cropland, and then return that water back to nature. And the results can be catastrophic. For example, the Colorado River never even makes it to the ocean anymore. We see major water declines in groundwater in the US, in Africa, and here an example in the former Soviet Union, where irrigation has collapsed the Aral Sea, one of the largest inland seas in the world. The water that naturally fed the Aral Sea has now been diverted and used to irrigate the deserts of Kazakhstan to grow cotton. So water use around the world from agriculture is causing the collapse of critical freshwater resources and ecosystems all over the planet. So agriculture uses more land and more water than anything else we do, not even close. It's also unfortunately responsible for the biggest sources of pollution on the planet, especially for water pollution. And a lot of that comes from agricultural chemicals, including fertilizers. And fertilizers spiked after the 1960s through the advent of the so-called Green Revolution, where we started using more highly tuned crop varieties. We started using far more agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, and irrigation to grow more food per acre. But that has consequences. Using this much fertilizer means some of it runs off into our water supplies and heads out into rivers and lakes and eventually into the ocean. And when you add this much fertilizer to water, it has consequences. It's essentially adding Miracle-Gro to the world's lakes and rivers and estuaries and causes algae blooms and collapsing aquatic ecosystems across many of the world's lakes and rivers and even coastal oceans, like the Gulf of Mexico that now has a huge dead zone caused by agricultural runoff. So agriculture not only uses more land and water than anything else in the world, it also produces more pollution and degrades water and ecosystems more than anything else we do. So this is a really, really scary kind of set of environmental impacts of our food system. And unfortunately, that's not all. Agriculture also contributes to climate change. And that's why we're here today, is talking about the links between food and climate. Now, normally when you think about climate change, we think about fossil fuels, and we should. But it turns out, and I'll show you where exactly, it turns out though that agriculture is a contributor to the rising levels of greenhouse gases causing climate change alongside our fossil fuel energies and industries and everything else. But when we see the rising levels of CO2, the rising levels of methane, and the rising levels of nitrous oxide, the three most important greenhouse gases causing climate change, we can see a very clear signature of agriculture, food, and land use, as well as energy in these curves. So we'll have to take a really hard look at this too. So I hope you can realize here how complicated food is. We definitely need a new approach to food, but it's one that needs to balance many different things at the same time. We need a food system that can provide nourishment and food security for the world across many different dimensions. We need to grow enough stuff. We need to make sure it turns into truly available food that's distributed and accessible fairly and equitably around the world and is also resilient to economic and environmental shocks. So we have to think about all the things food does for us. But we also have to think about the environmental goals of the food system, how we could limit its greenhouse gas emissions, its impact on biodiversity, its unsustainable use of water, and its being a big source of water pollution. So we need to figure out how to balance this multidimensional picture. The problem is right now we have a food system that doesn't feed everyone and can't keep up with future demands, at least not right now. And it causes more environmental harm than about anything else we do. So how do we fix this? How do we grow more food? Make sure we're really producing food security and at the same time reduce dramatically the impact food and agriculture has on the environment. That's the job ahead of us and how we fix this food system and feed a growing world without trashing the planet. Well, I'm convinced we can do this, and today we're going to consider one dimension of this problem, the links between climate change and the food system. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Again, when we think about climate change is caused by many things, fossil fuels being one of them, but it turns out that not only is producing electricity in our industry and transportation causing climate change, food and agriculture is one of the most important sectors. In fact, globally, when you look across the entire world, the direct emissions from food, agriculture, and land use to grow food is 22% of our greenhouse gas emissions right now. Well, what's under the hood? What makes up that 22%? Well, it includes many different things. It includes deforestation, methane from animals and rice, and farming practices. Let's walk through these individually. About half of the greenhouse gases coming from the larger food system comes from deforestation, clearing land, especially in tropical rainforest, mainly to grow food. I'll talk about this more later, but most of the deforestation in the world is to create land for animals, for beef in particular, or to grow animal feed, especially soybeans, or commodities like palm oil. So that's half right there, is just clearing land for more acreage. That we have to think about because it's the single biggest contributor. The next big one is one that we all joke about is the methane that comes from animals, especially ruminant animals, animals that have evolved to digest things that you and I can't eat, like grass and forbs and things like this, and digest it in a very interesting set of chambered stomachs. And then they burp methane back out into the atmosphere as a consequence of their digestive system. This is a natural evolutionary trick that some animals have come up with, but now we have many more cattle being fed a lot more than any wild animals ever would have been. So methane levels from animals have gone up enormously since prehistoric times, and that's because of animal agriculture. And we have to think about that too. We also have to think about the sources of greenhouse gases from managed soils, from the soils of our croplands and pastures, because we're tilling them, we're plowing them up all the time, and that breaks down organic matter in the soil. And we over-fertilize many of these, and that creates something called nitrous oxide that goes into the atmosphere. So we're kind of beating up the world's soils, and as a consequence, they're outgassing greenhouse gases. So we need to fix that too. Methane not only comes from animals, it also comes from rice, which is, kind of submerged in water year round. And we have to think about ways that we can grow rice without producing methane. And then we also have some greenhouse gases from a couple of other areas, including manure management and burning crop fields to reduce the residues around the world. So that's kind of where the emissions of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, mainly deforestation, then animals, then soils, and a little bit from rice manure and biomass burning. Farmlands can also do a little bit of what we call carbon removal. And this is an area that's really pretty exciting. The idea that if we manage our farming landscapes differently, they could absorb carbon and put carbon back into soils and into biomass. This is an idea called regenerative agriculture. But right now, carbon removal on our farms is really tiny and removes less than 0.1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, our farming systems are producing 22% of our greenhouse gases, about 200 times bigger. So right now, carbon removal is basically a round-off error compared to the emissions, and we'll have to think hard about this. Beyond the direct emissions of the food system, food also contributes to other kinds of emissions out there in the world. So I focused initially on this 22% that comes directly from growing food and farming and clearing land. That's really important. But it turns out food touches some of the other sectors as well. Like in electricity, we cook food, we cool food in refrigeration and cold chains around the world. We transport food. We also throw away food and it goes to landfills and often produces methane, which is counted in the industry sector. So when we look at all these kinds of emissions, we see directly the food system contributes 22% of the world's emissions. But when you add up everything else, especially food waste in landfills and refrigerating, transporting, cooking, processing, and packaging food, all that other stuff, that adds up to a total of 34%. So it turns out a whole third of our greenhouse gas emissions on the planet have something to do with food. Most of it is in growing the food itself. And we need to phase out these emissions. We can't ignore a third of the greenhouse gas problem and expect to solve climate change. Yes, the other two-thirds are mainly fossil fuels and industry, but a full third of climate change has something to do with food, and we've got to take that seriously. But the problem is these emissions are not getting phased out. In fact, they're growing. Even in countries like the United States, where we're seeing real progress now on lowering our emissions of greenhouse gases in electricity and industry, and now buildings and transportation, food emissions are still climbing rapidly in the United States and most of the countries in the world. In fact, all the countries where we're seeing some progress on climate change, it's not happening in the food sector. It's mainly through electricity, and then later in buildings through heat pumps and electric vehicles and transportation. The food sector, right now, those emissions are rising pretty much everywhere in the world, and no meaningful change is in sight. So we need a big reboot. A full third of the climate problem is not making progress and is tied up in food, and we have to think really hard of how to fix this. So how do we solve climate change in any sector? Well, first, we start by cutting the emissions. You know, if your bathtub's overflowing and pouring water out and destroying the floors of your house, the first thing we do is we turn off the taps. Then we get a sponge. But if you don't turn off the taps, if you don't cut the primary emissions from any economic sector, you're not going to stop climate change being caused by that economic sector. So we need to cut emissions in the food sector first and foremost. And this is where they are, to remind you. Half of it is deforestation, then methane from animals, ruminants, soils, methane from rice, manure, and biomass burning. These are the direct emissions, and we can cut these dramatically if we follow cutting emissions along 4 key pillars. Well, what are those pillars? Well, the first one is the most obvious and turns out to be probably the largest. Maybe we can work on the demand side of the food system, like how much food do we need and what kind of food? Maybe we could start there. Just like we start with energy efficiency, and then we switch to renewables when it comes to decarbonizing the energy system. Same idea, how do we be more efficient with the food we already have? Well, the first and best place to start would be to cut food loss and waste. A lot of the world's food is never eaten. In fact, it's about 30 to 40% globally. That's extraordinary. 30 to 40% of the world's food that we work so hard to grow is never even eaten. In rich countries, a lot of the food loss and waste happens near the consumer, from the market and the supply chain to the restaurants to our homes and so on. That's where we lose a lot of the food. In poor countries, though, it's closer to the farmer because there's a lot of food loss in the supply chain. Maybe the truck didn't get to the road to where the farmer could get their food to market, or maybe the train broke down. Poor infrastructure sometimes means food is lost between the farm and the market. And there's therefore a double tragedy, the loss of food and the loss of income, often for very poor farmers. So when we think about tackling food waste around the world and see if we can tackle that 30 to 40% of food waste, what we can see as environmental benefits of this is first, 30 to 40% of all the food and the emissions it took to grow that food weren't even necessary. For there's a huge upstream benefit of tackling food waste. That means 30 to 40% of the water we used to grow food wasn't necessary. 30 to 40% of the deforestation wasn't necessary. Fertilizers, not necessary, and so on. So there's huge upstream benefits of tackling food waste. We don't need to grow as much or pollute as much. And downstream, when we throw food away, a lot of times it goes into a landfill where it goes into an anaerobic, oxygen-free environment and produces methane as it breaks down. So food waste is a double win. You get upstream benefits from growing food that you didn't have to anymore, and downstream, you never threw it away to rot in a landfill ever. So this is a huge win for climate change, and food waste is the #1 solution when it comes to fixing food and climate change emissions. And it's near the top of the list no matter what you look at across all economic sectors. Food waste is a huge, huge issue. Another big issue is, unfortunately, our diets. And this is where we get into a little bit more nuanced conversation, and people get a little bit, a little passionate about this. And one of the reasons, though, it's so important is because of how much of our food system is devoted to doing different things. If we look at the world's food system, the green areas of the world are where we grow crops that produce human food, things that you and I would eat directly, like rice and wheat and fruits and vegetables and things like that that are grown on our farmland directly. The red areas of the world, especially the US and parts of Western Europe, Brazil, and Argentina, that you can see here, they're growing not food, but animal feed and biofuels. For example, if you drive across the Midwestern US, you see all this cornfield, every acre after acre after acre of cornfields. That corn isn't fed to people, it's being fed to cars and cows. And we then have to figure out how much of that turns into something we humans benefit from later. So it turns out around the world, only about 55% of all the crops that are grown are actually consumed by people. The rest of that 45%, that's being fed to animals and to automobiles. And when we do that, even though we feed the animals and we eat the animals later, we lose a lot of efficiency along the way. Because if we take 100 calories of crops, like 100 calories of corn or soybeans or something like that, we could turn that into 40 calories of milk, 22 calories of eggs, about 12 calories of chicken, and 10 of pork, but only 3 calories of beef. It turns out beef is an extremely inefficient way to turn photosynthesis into food. Only 3% of the feed that we give animals in feedlots turns into edible calories, and only 5% of the protein that's in the plants turns into animal protein. It's an absurdly inefficient way to produce food for people. So that's why we get all hung up about beef and climate change, because it's so inefficient of taking resources from plants and turning it into food as a steak, for example. And globally, this has a huge impact. Again, crop production, about 55% is used directly as food, about 36% is animal feed, and about 9% is biofuels and other stuff. The animal feed does become food, but on average, depending what kind of animal it is, only about 10% of that becomes edible calories. And so for every 100 calories we grow, the world's food system only produces 59 calories. 55 of those are vegetables and fruits and grains, 4 are animal products. So the animal part of this is really inefficient. And when we look around the world, we can see the impacts of that inefficiency. For example, this is a map showing how many people could live off of every acre of land. Let's zoom into the United States. We see here that 16 people could be fed off of the corn belt of the Midwest, for example, but in reality, only about 5 people are being fed off of that land. It went from 16 to 5 because we're sending all that crop production not to be food, but to go into cars and into animals, where so much of that energy is lost. Other countries do a better job than the US and feed more people per acre than we do because more of what they're growing is actual human food, not mediated through an animal. So this is why animal agriculture matters so much, because only 59% of the crops we grow actually become food, and we still lose another 30 to 40% of that due to food waste. So even shifting diets a little bit, changing that 59% closer to 100%, could have huge consequences to the food systems. So that's why we talk a lot about eating less animal agriculture and eating a little more plant-rich diets, because it just introduces huge efficiencies back into our food system. Another area too, of course, is phasing out crop-based biofuels. In the US, I live in Minnesota, surrounded by ethanol production and corn, but that corn could be used so much more effectively. For every 100 acres of ethanol that we grow in the United States right now, we could retire 99 acres of that back to prairie and convert just 1 acre to solar panels used to plug into electric vehicles and still come out ahead in terms of saving gasoline in this country. That's how inefficient corn-based ethanol is in the US. Other countries have maybe more or less efficient biofuel schemes like Brazil and the Europeans and others. But crop-based biofuels could be phased out as well, especially as electric vehicles come online. And that could also reduce demands on the agricultural system and lower emissions dramatically. So food waste, diets, and biofuels have to be considered when we look at climate change and food. Another big area we have to think about is protecting natural ecosystems, especially rainforest, because we're clearing so much of our forests today for agriculture. The red areas and the yellow areas, especially in the tropics in this map, are places where agricultural forces are clearing land for more production. For example, on the edges of the Amazon in Brazil, we're seeing land being cleared for cattle, for grazing lands to grow more beef, or to grow more soybeans. And those soybeans are overwhelmingly used as animal feed. So animal agriculture is driving most of the deforestation of the Amazon. That's also true in some other parts of the world, but over in Indonesia, we see most of that deforestation as being linked to palm oil, a cooking oil that we use for so many different things around the world. So between beef and animal feed and palm oil, we're driving so much of the world's deforestation. One of the scientists at Project Drawdown, Paul West, showed how that could have consequences on climate change by mapping how much carbon we lose by tearing down these rainforests to get more agricultural land versus the food that we actually ultimately get. And he produced a really interesting little index, which I'm showing here. In the red areas, it means we're burning a lot of carbon in these forests and not getting a lot of food for it. It's a very poor trade-off. And so we can target areas for protection across the Amazon, the Congo, West Africa, Malaysia, Indonesian archipelago, all of those regions to really target them for rainforest protection. In fact, one of the things that's so astonishing is between Brazil and Indonesia, just those two countries alone are half of the world's deforestation. Just two countries. And almost all of that is for beef, animal feed, and palm oil. So just a handful of countries and a handful of commodities, we can fix a lot of the deforestation emissions on the planet. Well, how do we do that? How do we curb deforestation? Well, it turns out there's a lot of great information out there now showing how indigenous communities, if we can support the land tenure and kind of land rights of indigenous communities in these countries, they take care of these forests in ways that others don't, and they hold on to them much longer with much richer biodiversity, more biomass, and much less deforestation. So working with indigenous communities seems to be the best way to protect these forests. Also, through international supply chains, we can have real transparency and obligations to not buy like soybeans that come from deforested land or beef that causes deforestation. How do we clean up supply chains that forces farmers and big commodity traders to not clear land to produce those same goods? And also people are talking about offset projects like carbon offsets that companies like to buy. And some of those involve maybe protecting rainforest. But lately, a lot of these have been called into question, whether they're really effective or not. I think they can be. Maybe sometimes they aren't today, but could we have better offset projects where money is used to help protect forests for carbon and for biodiversity? But mainly supporting Indigenous communities, having much more transparency and standards of the world's agricultural supply chains and international trade, and better next generation offset projects, we can protect these forests. And we need to. Again, rainforest clearing is half of the emissions of all the emissions coming from agriculture, and it's about 11% of the global total. To put that in comparison, the United States emits 10.5% of the world's emissions. Burning rainforest is 11%. It's more than the entire US economy, and we don't talk about it nearly enough. So preventing deforestation is a huge, huge deal. Well, what else can we do? We can also lower the emissions on the farms we still have. Once we reduce demand by cutting food waste, shifting diets, and phasing out biofuels, that helps. Once we protect rainforest, that helps too. But then we have the farms we have left. How do we lower the emissions on the farms that remain? Well, we have to look at several different areas. How do we lower emissions from the cattle that are still here? In addition to reducing the demand for meat and dairy around the world, which we have to do, how do we lower emissions from cattle we still raise, which will always be part of our food system? Are there additives? Are there breeding? Are there management techniques that can reduce emissions from cattle? Absolutely. And so there are ways we can reduce the methane emissions from this important livestock sector of the agricultural sectors of the world. Absolutely, we can do that. We can lower emissions from rice by changing the irrigation and fertilizer techniques of rice, managing them differently, dramatically cutting methane emissions for what is the most important crop in the world in terms of food security. We can also lower emissions from soils by maybe not tilling them as much, leaving residues in the soils in the winter, and maybe most importantly, changing our fertilizer use practices. James Gerber, another scientist here at Project Drawdown, has looked very carefully at this. And one of the things that's interesting about fertilizers, you can see in purple all the areas where you use a lot of fertilizer, the US, Europe, China, and India in particular. But it turns out fertilizers are kind of like the Goldilocks story we all heard as a kid. Some places use too much, like Shandong, China, uses way too much fertilizer for the yields they're getting. But some places, like Western Ethiopia, have too little. If we could boost the available nutrients in the soil in Ethiopia, you could get more yield. You could get more food, especially in a place where food is really in short supply. That would be great. Small uses of compost, manure, organic fertilizers, maybe a little bit of commercial fertilizer could grow more food in Ethiopia, but in China, we could cut it back. What if we went from these two extremes of too much and too little, and we went to Goldilocks and got it just right? Let's dial back the amount of fertilizers used in China, and let's dial it up a little bit in Ethiopia and find ways to get a more optimal use of fertilizers that gives you the most food for the least pollution. We can totally do that. And it turns out the excess fertilizers in the world are concentrated in a few places. It's concentrated in China, India, and the United States account for about 2/3 of the excess fertilizers used around the world, mostly for things in wheat, rice, and corn. Paul West had a paper out a few years ago that really highlighted these leverage points in fertilizer use. And we can identify quite clearly the regions of the world by cutting back on fertilizers in China, India, Western Europe, and the Midwestern US in particular. We could dramatically curb N2O emissions and water pollution without sacrificing any food at all. Other places could use a little bit more compost or manure, for example, and get a lot more food, but without much pollution. So getting a better fertilizer management will be crucial to feeding more people and dramatically reducing pollution from the soils. So we can clean up the food system in general by curbing our demands on food from food waste, diets, biofuels. We can protect rainforests and we can farm better. We can also clean up the other parts of the food system. For example, cleaning up our cooking. That's going to be very, very important. Refrigeration is a major part of this, and also transportation. These are all really important elements of the larger food system. Most important, though, is food waste going to landfills, and that hopefully will occur by reducing food waste as well. But when we put all this together, these four big pillars of cutting emissions really can do a lot. By curbing demands, by changing food waste, diets, and biofuels, we get this much. We can then protect rainforest and prevent this much carbon from going into the atmosphere. We can farm better on the remaining lands, and we can clean up the rest of the larger food system. These are all huge opportunities to cut emissions from the source in across our larger food system. And there are many, many opportunities to do this while boosting food production, nutrition, and farmer incomes around the world. There are some real win-wins here. Beyond cutting emissions, now we get to also talk about removing carbon from our working lands. And there are two different ways we can do that. First and foremost, probably the easiest way is to restore natural ecosystems, what we might call rewilding. By reducing the demands on the food system, if we get rid of food waste, and if we maybe change our diets a little, and we reduce the use of silly biofuels, we just spared a whole bunch of land that is no longer necessary for agricultural production. And we could put it back to wild nature. For example, we could restore huge areas of forest and woodlands around the world if we curb demands. We could restore grasslands and savannas across the world, peatlands, coastal ecosystems, and all of these incredible ecosystems, restoring wild areas, restoring biodiversity, and restoring the carbon they held from the atmosphere for so, so long. So that's the first way to do it, is through rewilding. Another way to go, though, is on the working lands we have left, the croplands and pastures that we still use for farming. And this is where the idea of so-called regenerative agriculture comes in. The idea that we could farm in ways that put back carbon onto the working lands, as well as the wild lands. But in this case, the working lands, regenerative agriculture could put carbon back to good soils through changing cropping practices, increasing agroforestry, putting trees back in the landscape, and managing the way animals graze in ways that can actually restore soil carbon and soil health by mimicking the behavior of large herds that might have been of wild animals in the past. And there's some great ideas here because this kind of regenerative agriculture can build back soils and biomass, which has dramatic impacts on water quality and the ability of soils to hold water. That has a huge benefit right now for climate resilience. It helps withstand droughts and floods much better, making the soil more spongy and able to hold moisture far better than it does today. But there are some challenges of regenerative agriculture. First and foremost, it's a fairly limited amount of land that we could do this effectively for limited amounts of time. Also, some of these practices take up more land, like regenerative grazing, grass-fed grazing through holistic grazing, takes 2.5 times more land, produce the same amount of beef that, that conventional beef systems use today. So it would take up an enormous amount of land to grow all the world's animals this way. So we'd have to think about that pretty hard. The other thing is these effects tend to be temporary, that we can build up soils for a while, but they eventually kind of slow down and saturate how much carbon is held in a soil or in a tree or in biomass. And lastly, we have to worry about the so-called permanence of these solutions. Farmers today might farm regeneratively for a while. What about the next landowner, the person who inherits the land in the future? Will they just plow it up and change practices, throwing that carbon right back into the atmosphere? Or if we plant trees, how do we guarantee that those trees aren't cut down or burned down in the future? So we have to be very careful about these kinds of things and make sure we're not listening to too much hype. Unfortunately, regenerative agriculture has been very mixed with a lot of hype lately, where the rhetoric isn't matched by the data very well. It's still a great idea, but tone down the expectations a little bit because the science is coming in now and it's coming in a lot less than the initial enthusiastic hype that we all heard about regenerative. It's also running a risk of greenwashing. If we only do the regenerative building back the soils, but we ignore diets, we ignore food waste, we ignore deforestation, we ignore fertilizers, we can't possibly pencil out enough of solutions to stop climate change. In a way, it's similar to carbon capture is with fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry wants you to believe carbon capture will take care of everything, and we don't need to cut our fossil fuels. But we know that's not true. We have to cut fossil fuels dramatically first and rely on carbon capture as a distant second. Same thing with regenerative ag. We have to cut the emissions from our diets, from food waste, from deforestation and poor farming practices, and then rely on regenerative agriculture and rewilding as a secondary solution. So again, mostly like every other part of climate change, cutting emissions is never optional. That's always job number one, two, and three. And not or, and we use carbon removal schemes, in this case using nature, in addition, but not instead of. So the approach that Drawdown is putting forward here is that we should look at 6 pillars of climate action in the food sector: cutting demands, protecting ecosystems, especially forest, farming better, fixing the rest of the food system, and rewilding and regenerative agriculture, and do them all together. We don't just pick one, we do all 6 full tilt simultaneously together and put together a really great portfolio of climate actions that not only reduces climate change from the food sector, it also increases food security, restores biodiversity, cleans water, restores water resources, and improves the world's nutrition. This could be a very good win-win set of solutions across the board for people and the planet today and tomorrow. So what have we learned in this little exercise today? Well, we've learned a couple of critical things, and we'll turn to questions in a second here. We've learned that food and agriculture and land use is a significant part of the climate problem. We know where the emissions are, mostly from deforestation and animal agriculture and bad farming practices. We need to address all those. We have a set of solutions that are here and ready to go today, but we have to think of a portfolio of them, mostly cutting emissions by curbing demands, protecting forests, farming better, etc., and removing carbon through rewilding and regenerative practices all at the same time. But making sure the top priority is cutting the emissions immediately from food waste, more sustainable diets, phasing out biofuels, protecting forest, low emissions farming, etc. And additionally, removing carbon through rewilding and regenerative practices all at the same time. Acknowledging carbon removal is inherently risky. It may not be permanent, and it can be used as greenwashing if we're not careful, but we should do it anyway. So next steps, what can we do next? Well, this year, starting right now, Project Drawdown is going to take a special look at the food system because it's been kind of the hardest one to solve of all the sectors contributing to climate change. We have great solutions now in electricity. We're starting to have great solutions in buildings like heat pumps. We're starting to have great solutions in transportation and industry, but in the food sector, we are way behind where we should be, and we're kind of dealing mostly in kind of hype and greenwashing rather than substantive solutions. So Drawdown's going to do a lot of work in the coming year, and you'll hear more very soon, where we're going to entirely rethink all of our solutions framework and come up with entirely new solutions and map them, not just giving you a global average number, but as you saw in this presentation, drill down to the specific pixel level, showing how these solutions would work all across the world using big data to guide us. Along the way, of course, we're going to try to engage key stakeholders who work in the food systems of the world and share everything we're doing with the broader world, like we're starting to today. And I hope that this has been helpful and really excites some interesting conversations. But looking forward, I think one of the things we're going to have to get really good at is learning how to collaborate better. This is a very thorny problem, and it's going to require all of us, people who produce food, the businesses that sell it and move it around the world, and all of us who eat it. We're going to have to rethink a really fundamental part of our society and the food system. And it's going to require collaboration, not confrontation. We're going to have to kind of put aside our initial kind of rhetoric and try to find constructive ways to collaborate that brings everybody on board and finds ways to get the food system to be better. And we need to be guided by evidence, not hype, not rhetoric, not what we see in social media necessarily, but what the science tells us is true. Let's be guided by data, not rhetoric. And we're going to have some big changes. And some of these are going to be hard, and these are some tricky waters ahead. But I'm actually really excited because we can start now and build the future we want. We can build a better food system that is more sustainable and performs so much better for the environment, of course, but also can feed more people more nourishing meals every day, provides better livelihoods for rural communities and farmers around the world, and does a better job of nourishing and sustaining the human population and civilization moving forward and sustaining nature and our planetary systems. We can absolutely do both. I'm 100% convinced of this. We have the solutions in place to do this, but now it's time to get to work and implement and scale these solutions as quickly as we can. So with that, I'll stop here and just say thank you so much for your attention and your time. And I think we've got quite a few questions out there in the audience. So why don't we turn it over to Todd and see if we can have some conversation and Q&A. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. And we do have a lot of questions coming in. This might be one of the most active behind the scenes conversations we've ever seen for a presentation. So a lot of great questions coming in from our audience today. I want to start with a question here that just came in towards the end. Someone was saying that they might worry a little bit that one of the takeaways from this presentation is that farmers are the bad actors. They're tilling up the land, growing only animal feed and biofuels, when farmers are actually producing what the market allows them to make a profit on and meet their bottom line.
Mhm.
And this person sees them as being really, really key players in reducing food-related emissions. So
Mhm.
two-part question here they're asking, what policies do you support or perhaps oppose that are preventing us from creating this better food system and while still giving farmers a living wage? And then what would you like to see from the Farm Bill? What's not there right now that if you could wave your magic wand, you would change?
Well, first and foremost, farmers, we owe all of us who are alive today owe a huge debt of gratitude to farmers. Of course, they're heroes. These are people who work so hard every day to work the land, to provide resources for us to feed the world, literally. We would not be, we wouldn't exist as a civilization today if we didn't have agriculture and the incredible farmers out there today. So nobody should be vilifying farmers. Absolutely not. But we're all trapped in a system that isn't always the best system for anybody, including the farmers. So I think we need to kind of rethink the larger system. And we're part of that system. What we eat, what we demand, what we throw away, what we pay for, what we don't want to pay for. And all that is really critical. So I think we all have to take a hard look in the mirror and say, hey, look, we're all in this together. Don't point fingers. Let's all extend hands in collaboration. That's what I mean by collaboration. So no, let's not vilify anybody. We're all in this one together. But we do have food systems that are kind of not doing the best. If our goal is to nourish and feed the world sustainably and equitably and in a healthy way and preserve our environment, we obviously could do better. So are we kind of subsidizing certain forms of agriculture preferentially over others, picking winners and losers in the food system through government subsidies and policies? Yeah, you bet we are. And is that good for farmers? Nope. It's good for a few farmers, but not all of them. So, for example, in the United States, we have a heavy-handed kind of policy that encourages corn production. We have 100 million acres in this country growing corn. That's the size of Montana, by the way. And most of it's being used for biofuels that don't really work and aren't helping this country be more energy secure or have better environmental conditions. It has failed miserably in those goals. It's a political calculus more than a real health, environment, nutrition, and economic calculus. It's not doing the best job for the greatest good. So I'd like to have a food system that does the greatest public good with the least public harm. I think of a food system like, let's see how much food it can produce and healthy, sustainable food that promotes farmers to make good money and have a good living wage, and nutrition and sustainability for the least amount of harm to the planet and to people. Let's get that food system. Let's subsidize that one. But right now, I think what we have is some special interest within the food system. We're putting a big thumb on the scale in Brussels and in Paris and in Washington, D.C. and Beijing and other places, and maybe not looking out for the rest of us, just like we've seen with the energy sector. We have some special interests that are putting a big thumb on the scale of policy, preferentially preferring fossil fuels versus renewables. And that's the same thing versus big commodity ag versus regenerative ag, things like that. We need to kind of insist on a better food system, but never leave the farmers out because they are the heroes who are the ones making this all work. And we must honor that.
Great. I also wanted to say too to the audience here today that thank you for all these questions and comments you're giving us. As John mentioned, this is the start of a major new initiative here at Project Drawdown. And so, your comments and your questions. We're not going to get to them all today. There are hundreds of questions literally in the background, but they're going to inform our future work, future research, future webinars, articles we might be writing. So thank you for all the comments you've provided. We've captured everything that you've submitted here today. John, there's one sensitive topic that keeps coming up in the Q&A, and I hope you'll be okay with me asking you about this question. Number of people are wondering about, they're asking, it's not really a question of agriculture, it's a question of population. How
Oh,
do you
yeah.
think about that? How do you respond to that when that comes up?
Yeah, it's very natural to raise that question because, at first glance, we think of the environmental footprint of each of us on the planet, right? And the number of feet on the planet, so the number of people multiplied by the resources we use per person has a total aggregate impact. So there are two levers here, how much we all consume and then how many of us there are. So it's very natural that people say, well, isn't this just a problem of population? It turns out, though, the math doesn't really support that. First of all, yes, we are 8 billion people, but only, a few hundred million of us are causing a disproportionate amount of the resource consumption and pollution. So it's kind of the richest and most affluent and the most wasteful parts of that population that have a much bigger footprint than the folks at the lower end of the spectrum. And where populations are still growing, which is actually not much of the world's population is slowing down its growth rate dramatically. I personally doubt we're going to reach 9 billion people because population growth has slowed so quickly and screeching to a halt in most of the world. It's only a few countries in the world that are still seeing significant increases in population. And they're often very poor countries that don't use resources very much and are not very wasteful. So ironically, the growth of population is a much smaller driver of what's happening compared to the increasing consumption of the world's middle class and rich classes. So it's really increasing kind of consumption of meat and dairy, increasing demands for biofuels, increasing food waste of the people already here that's driving two-thirds of the growth of food demands, not population growth. And that's not even getting into the morality of telling other people what they should do about their families. I don't feel comfortable with that. But even just as a scientist, the math does not say that population growth is what's driving the problem. It's not. It's really consumption of those of us already here. And that's just a scientific fact. So those of us here now should do a better job of working with our resources, living more sustainably, and encouraging a food system that's much more sustainable. And don't point fingers to people who aren't even here yet. With that said, I think we also want to encourage more access to family planning and education for women and girls around the world, which has always been a drawdown solution. But because it's the right thing to do as a human rights issue and a health issue, and it helps bend demographic curves in the future, but never, ever, ever point the finger at population of those people. That's the problem because it's not true. So we need to do better.
Excellent. Thanks for taking on that question.
Yep.
Uh, I love this question that also came in from someone in the middle of the United States here. This person says, I'm in Nebraska and
Yep.
don't have representatives in Congress, I'm assuming, that are open to this message of changing our agricultural systems. I'm mostly vegetarian myself and I compost. Is there anything else I can do? So that kind of gets down to the individual actions level. What do you think, what more could we as individuals be doing within this larger food system that we have?
Yeah, well, I live in Minnesota, and I too do not have representatives who would agree with anything I just said, at least publicly. Privately, they do, of course, but they'd run into a lot of political headaches if they kind of start talking about getting rid of ethanol or talking about food waste and diets. And unfortunately, the US Farm Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which are supposed to be thinking about climate change, aren't even beginning to talk about the real issues. We're not talking about ethanol, which emits more CO2 than it saves. We're not talking about our meat and dairy systems. You can't even begin to talk about that in Congress. And you can't talk about food waste, which is kind of silly because I've never met anybody from the pro food waste lobby. So we're going to have to do a little bit of this ourselves while the politicians catch up. We're going to have to work with our communities at the local level. We're going to have to work with businesses and we're going to have to work at the household level. And I think with policymakers too, and work on all these levers of change simultaneously. So yeah, at home, I think number one, when people ask me like, hey, what can I do at home at the household level, the neighborhood level? One is keep talking about this, learn more, keep talking. That's always the best place to start. I also encourage people not to be very polarizing in their language and attitudes. Like you might like being a vegetarian, doesn't mean your neighbors do. But you know what, we can all dial down some of our diets a little bit. Maybe we could skip a little bit of, high impact foods occasionally and still eat them once in a while. That's what I do. I'm not a vegetarian. I eat meat once in a while, but a lot less. You choose what you want to do. It's a lot of different things enter into this. But I think food waste is a good place to begin because it saves money and it's pretty visible and it's not very controversial. And it's, by the way, the biggest lever. So reducing food waste. Let's eat our leftovers. Let's make sure we, share what we have. Or give it to your pets if you can't eat it or whatever. And make sure what you do throw away, try to compost it if you can at home, or try to advocate for municipal compost so it doesn't end up in a landfill producing methane. So these are all things we can do at home, but a little bit of diets, a little bit of food waste, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, I think will help out. But we need some big changes here, and it's not going to come only from us individually. It has to come from business, investors, philanthropy, but also at the end of the day from policy shifts as well. We need to pull every lever we can, and the nice thing is they're synergistic. When you reduce food waste, it's like voting every single day with your habits, not just with the voting station, the polling place. So let's do a little bit of that and make sure you vote and be engaged in the policy process as well.
So we're at the top of the hour now. So just to wrap up, maybe in 30 seconds or less here, and then we'll let everyone go. What's the big takeaway message you want people to leave with here today?
Well, the big takeaway is a better food system is possible, that we absolutely have the tools we have to make a food system that is more equitable, fairer, more sustainable, and healthier and better for farmers. It does mean confronting some special interest and changing a few things, but the good news is we have an abundance of tools and approaches that when we put them together can make a better food system, not one that's just better for the environment, but better for all of us. And that system's within reach if we really work for it. And that's what we at Project Drawdown are going to be striving to do this year.
Excellent. Thanks again, John, for the time today. I just want to share with everyone that we'll be sending out a recording of today's talk here in the next couple of days. And I encourage you to join us on April 25th, right around Earth Day, when my colleague Ayana Bodhi will be joining us for Drawdown Ignite. Really looking forward to that. She's going to be talking all about climate action we can take at work. So hope to see you in April. And we'll send out the registration link for that soon too. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and take care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.